To truly understand what happened at Matewan, one needs to take a serious look at the fractious and violent labor disputes of the time. However, even with the shots no longer ringing out from the Hatfields and McCoys, and the Paint Cabin Creek strike had also cooled by this time, there was still unrest in the Tug River Valley. The Matewan Massacre and the battle for Blair Mountain would forever change the face of mining in the United States and cement the standing of the unions. The Matewan Massacre was far more than just an extension of the Hatfield and McCoy dispute that had been raging in the area. It had been nearly 30 years since the Hatfield and McCoy feud was in full swing. By the time of the Matewan conflict, the feud proper between the two families had cooled. The courts had ruled on the parties involved in the violence. Those that were guilty were spending their time behind bars. There will be several times that the name of Hatfield will show up in the West Virginia Coal Wars, as some major characters will appear over the course of the story. We have already seen Governor Hatfield and his Hatfield contract, and how he had allowed for some civil and constitutional abuses to go on under his first term in office. There are more Hatfields to come, and their influence over the conflict will be epic. Lasting between April 18, 1912 through July 1913, there were approximately 50 deaths directly related to the Paint Cabin Creek strike of 1912, as well as many more deaths in the Holly Grove camps due to starvation and malnutrition. Estimates from the damages from the strike and violence would cost about $100 million. Even though there were hundreds of arrests made, they were released from jail and allowed to return to work. The coal operators in Baldwin Felts were never charged or implicated in their part of the strike, which would cause a lasting trend to this day. The Paint Cabin Creek strike is being one of the more violent labor confrontations in history. The unions felt that they could get more help with the Copper County strike if they coordinated a strike of the Colorado coal fields with the copper strike of Michigan. Between September 1913 and April 1914, the Colorado Front Range saw the largest uprising of labor against the coal company operators in the West. Due to deadly working conditions and low pay, the workers organized with the United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, against Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron, CF&I. The Colorado Coal War of September 1913 saw the deaths of somewhere between 69 to 199 people to make it the bloodiest labor dispute in history. Tensions climaxed in the Colorado coal strike when in Logan County, a tent city that was occupied by around 1,200 striking coal miners and their families, were attacked on April the 20th, 1914, by the Colorado National Guard. The Ludlow Massacre saw the deaths of 21 people, which included women and children. In retaliation, the miners armed themselves and attacked dozens of mines and other targets during the next 10 days. Strike breakers were killed, property was destroyed, and 225 miles of the area now became a war ground. The violence only ended with the federal soldiers showing up to calm the situation. No concessions were made to the miners after the strike was over in December of 1914. While these conflicts did lead to 8-hour or 9-hour days depending upon the state, in some cases did make the existing laws on the books for labor more enforceable, not a lot was being accomplished at this time in making headway for the betterment of those that were striking. And for a short time, in Michigan, the Union was run out of the state for its lack of help with the negotiations. The unions felt that they could get more help with the Copper County strike if they coordinated a strike of the Colorado coal fields with the copper strike of Michigan. Between September 1913 and April 1914, the Colorado Front Range saw the largest uprising of labor against the coal company operators in the West. Due to deadly working conditions and low pay, the workers organized with the United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, against Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron, CF&I. The Colorado Coal War of September 1913 saw the deaths of somewhere between 69 to 199 people to make it the bloodiest labor dispute in history. Tensions climaxed in the Colorado coal strike when in Logan County, a tent city that was occupied by around 1,200 striking coal miners and their families, were attacked on April the 20th, 1914, by the Colorado National Guard. The Ludlow Massacre saw the deaths of 21 people, which included women and children. In retaliation, the miners armed themselves and attacked dozens of mines and other targets during the next 10 days. Strike breakers were killed, property was destroyed, and 225 miles of the area now became a war ground. The violence only ended with the federal soldiers showing up to calm the situation. No concessions were made to the miners after the strike was over in December of 1914. While these conflicts did lead to 8-hour or 9-hour days depending upon the state, in some cases did make the existing laws on the books for labor more enforceable, not a lot was being accomplished at this time in making headway for the betterment of those that were striking. And for a short time, in Michigan, the Union was run out of the state for its lack of help with the negotiations. Uneasy years had passed since the Paint Cabin Creek, West Virginia strike of 1912, and the battles of the coal fields of Colorado and the copper mines of Michigan. A U.S. Senate committee held a hearing over the treatment of the miners in all three states and had made deals with the governors to maintain peace and to have better treatment of those who were working in the mines by instituting fair labor laws. However, this movement to improve the lives of the miners was not improving fast enough, and events would take place that would make the Appalachian Mountains of the Tug River Valley explode in violence and outright war. The issue at hand was for better pay, better treatment of the miners, and removal of the paternalism from the area. The miners were also asking for the right to unionize as well as better working conditions. Paternalism is the practice of people who have business or other authority to restrict the freedoms of those who are subordinate to them. If those who are under them behave in an approved manner, then they will receive housing, work, food, and other perks of their position. If, for example, they did not behave in the way that the companies wanted them to, they would lose all of their benefits up to and including their jobs. We have now set the stage for the unrest that was going on in the labor force at the time. Nothing had been solved, and tempers were boiling under the surface. It will soon reach the point of boiling over, and the day of reckoning will be at hand. United Mine Workers of America President John L. Lewis targeted Mingo County for organizing and membership, then started ramping up the membership drives. Mingo County was chosen because many of the politicians there were pro-union men, and the political structure was more independent than many of the surrounding counties that were under the strict coal company grip. Cabell Testerman, the mayor of Matewan, and his 27-year-old police chief, Sid Hatfield, were both supporters of the Union. With the help of Testerman and Hatfield, Union organizers were able to gain a foothold, and the organizing accelerated in Mingo County rapidly. Between 275 and 300 people joined during that time. The UMWA got a huge membership boost in Matewan in Mingo County, West Virginia on April the 22nd and April the 23rd of 1920. The Union began giving demands to the Burnwell Coal and Coke Company. The miners wanted the right to shop in non-company stores. They also wanted the armed mine guards to stop watching everything that they did. In response, the Burnwell Coal and Coke Company fired all of the now unionized mine workers. The company gave them 3 days to vacate all of the company-owned housing. The company would then hire private detectives and public law enforcement agents to ensure that the unions were kept out of their towns. The coal operators and their paid enforcers would use intimidation, harassment, beatings, murder, and espionage to drive home the point that the Union men would not be tolerated. Their most common practice to block the Unions from their coal towns were to fire all Union sympathizers, blacklist all of those known to be part of the Union, and evicting all Union members from their homes. Many times the miners would come against the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency when they were brought in to bust up coal mine strikes. On April 27, 1920, Baldwin Felts agent Albert C. Felts was arrested for illegally evicting miners of the Burnwell Coal and Coke Company as punishment for their union activity. This action did not go over very well with either side, so Mingo County Sheriff G.T. Blankenship negotiated with each side to agree as long as only Mingo County officials enforced the eviction notices that the miners would be peaceful toward them and comply with the rules. During this time, the miners continued to join the UMWA. On May 6, 1920, the UMWA held a meeting that swelled to around 3,000 people from Matewan and the surrounding areas to air their grievances. Immediately after the strike was declared, all of the miners were evicted from their homes for joining the Union, and the companies refused to compromise. So in response, on May 17, 1920, the UMWA began setting up tent cities for their now homeless members and sympathizers in the area named Lick Creek. Along the Tug River, very quickly became a growing colony of unemployed, idle, angry, and homeless mass of miners. Even facing living in tents and being harassed, the numbers of those joining the Union continued to grow, with the numbers reaching close to 4,000 miners by early May. At the nearby Stone Mountain Coal Company, every single worker there had joined the UMWA and was therefore fired and evicted from their homes. Tensions in the Tug River Valley are now boiling over. Thousands of people are now being forced to live in tents in a small area. Conditions there are stable, but there are thousands of out-of-work men who are angry and with nothing else to do. The question as to who would have legal authority in the town of Matewan and who did not would also come into play as the Matewan Massacre would take shape. The miners were on strike protesting for better pay, fighting for the right to organize, and better treatment from the operators. Thousands of people are now forced to live in tents in the small area by the Tug River. Conditions there are stable, but there are thousands out-of-work men who are angry and nothing else to do. Today, we will discuss the most infamous event of the Matewan conflict that would forever be compared to the OK Corral, and the criminal trial that would light the flame to the powder keg. These two events will lead to outright war in the Appalachian Mountains and will go down as the largest armed labor uprising in America. The Stone Mountain Coal Company had hired the agents to evict the miners and to harass them until the strike broke up. Until this moment, there were very few major conflicts in the area. However, the Stone Mountain Coal Company wanted to maintain control over the situation and to suppress the continued efforts to organize. Executive Albert Felts brought 12 Baldwin Felts detective agents who came from Bluefield, West Virginia, to Matewan, West Virginia, to break up the strike using all means necessary. Sheriff Hatfield encouraged the miners to arm themselves when the detectives arrived in Matewan. Both Albert Felts and C.B. Cunningham had both been involved in the violent and deadly Ludlow, Colorado strike 6 years earlier. Baldwin Felts agents were now very well seasoned and learned many lessons about how to break up strikes using violent tactics and intimidation methods. On this morning, the men were hard at work evicting people from their company-owned houses and forcibly removing mining families from the independent tent camp that had formed on Lick Creek for trying to organize. Arriving at the tent site, Sheriff Hatfield and Mayor Testerman went to investigate why people from Tent City were being evicted, claiming that Albert and Lee Felts had no legal authority to do so. Hatfield and Testerman then demanded to see the warrants given to the agents for this action, as they contested their authority in the township. Albert and Lee Felts were unable to produce any warrants for their actions and falsely claimed that this situation was sanctioned by the court orders. All of this was being carried out under the watchful eye of the miners and their families. Seeing that there was trouble brewing, the miners then began to arm themselves and made their way into the town in case that there would be a larger conflict to happen. The agents then came back to Matewan later that day. Both sides claimed that they had the right to arrest the other side. The verbal altercation became very heated at this point. Other sources claimed that the agents were leaving town when the argument broke out between the agents and the pro-union police chief, Sid Hatfield, and Mayor Testerman. What is clear is that the dispute turned violent. There are details, but again, decide for yourself as to which side that you want to believe. In story one of the Baldwin Felts agents moved to arrest the sheriff, and he shot and killed Mayor Testerman when he stepped in to intervene on behalf of Hatfield. In story 2, Hatfield initiated the shootout by either signaling a prepared ambush or shooting the agent himself. It is unclear as to who shot first to start the gunfight. However, the battle lasted a total of 15 minutes. When the shooting had stopped, 10 men, including 2 coal miners, Albert Felts, his brother Lee, 5 other Baldwin Felts detectives, and Matewan Mayor Cable Testerman were all dead. This event would forever be known as the Matewan Massacre. Captain Brocus raided the Lick Creek tent colony in June 1920. There was a gun skirmish within the colony between the miners and Brocus and the Martins men. The state police, in response, had the tents destroyed, scattered belongings of the miners and their families, and miners were shot and arrested. It had only been 3 months since the Matewan Massacre, and the civil unrest was escalating. Martial law was enacted and federal troops came into the area. This lasted for a short time as the threat of a statewide general strike of all Union coal miners of West Virginia was threatened. The Federal troops backed down. The Matewan Massacre became a rally cry for the Union activists across the country, with Sid Hatfield garnering fame for his defense of the miners. Hatfield had escaped the massacre without injury and became a symbol of the fight against tyranny and violence of the company. By July 1st, 1920, the operators had seemed to lose their fight, as 90% of the miners in Mingo County joined with the UMWA and joined in the strike. There are several armed skirmishes between the miners and the Guard. This was because of the mine closures and rail routes, along with companies bringing in non-union replacement workers that lasted into the fall of 1920. Thomas Phelps, the Baldwin Phelps agency chief, hired a team of lawyers to bring charges against Sid Hatfield and 18 other men who were accused of participating in the shootout for the crime of murdering Albert Phelps. The trial began on January 28, 1921. Close to 40 armed Baldwin Phelps agents lined the streets of Williamson to intimidate the pro-Union jury. After the lengthiest murder trial in West Virginia history, there was not enough evidence to bring a conviction. None of the 19 men who were indicted were convicted of the killings. The West Virginia state legislature passed a bill allowing the criminal cases to be prosecuted with summoned juries from other counties. Murder charges were then again brought against the 19 men for the deaths of the other 6 Baldwin Phelps agents. Hatfield, along with Ed Chambers, his deputy, were also brought up on charges for destroying the Mohawk mining camp in McDowell County. Hatfield and Chambers traveled unarmed to court with their wives on August 1st, 1921, to stand trial. Awaiting them were the Baldwin Phelps agents who shot and killed them on the McDowell County Courthouse steps. C. E. Lively, Buster Pence, and Bill Salter, who were Baldwin Phelps agents, were acquitted of the murders of the Hatfields and Chambers on grounds of self-defense. These two events would set off a firestorm of the fight between the miners and the operators. Miners were outraged by the assassinations of Hatfield and Chambers. They understood that the assassins would not face punishment for the crimes. The miners then organized and armed themselves across the state of West Virginia. One source states that Little Tug River was the first to organize and began patrolling and guarding their area. Sheriff Don Chafin sent troops to stop the activity. However, the troops were captured, disarmed, and sent fleeing from the area. Frank Keenly and Fred Mooney were leaders of the United Mine Workers, Union District 17. They called for a rally in Charleston, West Virginia. There they met with Governor Ephraim Morgan and presented him with the Union demands. The governor refused these demands. Within days, thousands of Union supporters came to the outskirts of Marmot, which is near the state capital of Charleston. According to one source, between 5,000 to 20,000 miners gathered in Lynn's Creek. Both sides were intent to march to Matewan. Some were already armed, others gathered arms and ammunition on the way with the town's help that were along the path to Matewan. Led by Frank Keenly and Fred Mooney, on August 24, 1921, they marched upon Mingo County to confront the coal companies, to organize the county, free the imprisoned Union men there, as well as to end martial law. Many of the marchers were WW1 veterans. To distinguish themselves on the battlefield, the miners tied red bandanas around their necks. This was so that they could be seen by fellow miners and not be shot accidentally through the wooded area. Many historians believe that this is where the term redneck comes from to this day. Logan County became the battleground, as anti-Union Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin had gathered men to stop the miners from reaching Matewan. In that number were between 2,000 and 3,000 Baldwin Felts agents, county police, state militiamen, deputies, citizen militiamen, and state police. The men had constructed machine gun nests and trenches around the base of Blair Mountain and had prepared themselves for the arrival of the marching miners. At the last minute, Keenly and Mooney tried to stop the march. They had met with War Department's General Harry Banholtz. The general had warned the men that any violence would be blamed upon the Union. A ceasefire was proposed, but collapsed when 2 miners died in a skirmish with Sheriff Don Chafin and his men. The 5,000 to 20,000 Union miners had reached the border of Logan County and had begun trading gunfire with the company's supporters. Both sides met at Blair Mountain, West Virginia. The fight began between the miners and the blockade. Sheriff Chafin had fewer men, but was better armed with rented aircraft, machine guns, and bombs. On August 28, 1921, the 5,000 to 20,000 Union miners had reached the border of Logan County and had begun trading gunfire with the company's supporters. Both sides met at Blair Mountain, West Virginia. The fight began between the miners and the blockade. Sheriff Chafin had fewer men, but was better armed with rented aircraft, machine guns, and bombs. On August 30, 1921, President Warren G. Harding threatened to enact martial law in West Virginia and all counties affected by the conflict. Those counties were Boone, Mingo, Logan, and Kanawha. He gave the ultimatum that the fighting had to cease by noon on September the 1st of that year. Also standing at the ready were troops from the 26th and 19th Infantry Divisions at Camp Dix, New Jersey, and Camp Sherman, Ohio. The troops would be sent by train to West Virginia when needed. On August 31st, 1921, the heavy fighting started when the group of 75 miners, led by Reverend Wilburn, came across a group of Logan's defenders on the ridge. Each side asked the other for a password. When the wrong one was given, the fighting started. 3 deputies and 1 miner were killed in the skirmish. Later that day, the main group of miners gave a two-pronged attack against the trenches and breastworks of the Logan's defenders. Using machine gun fire from the higher ground, the defenders were able to push back the Redneck Army despite their overwhelming numbers. On September 1st, 1921, the Redneck Army looted a company store and got a Gatling gun and assaulted a spot called Craddock Fork. Fighting went on for 3 hours as the defenders were using their machine gun. When the machine gun jammed, the miners made a huge surge forward and broke the defensive line, only to be pushed back by a second machine gun. Chafin had chartered 3 private biplanes and had them equipped with homemade bombs, pipe bombs loaded with nuts and bolts, and tear gas. This effort failed to inflict any casualties, even though they were dropped over 2 of the Redneck Army's strongholds. A squadron of U.S. Army reconnaissance planes began patrolling the skies on this day and the next day. The troops from the U.S. Army and Army National Guard, led by William Eubanks, a McDowell County native, arrived and started unloading equipment. On September 2, 1921, ignoring the threat, the Union leaders continued to encourage the miners to continue fighting. 2,500 Federal troops arrived with machine guns and armed military aircraft. They also brought gas bombs and explosives that were used in World War I. Seeing that they were now fighting a losing battle, the miners and the Unions backed off and disarmed themselves. Fighting, however, continued in some areas until September 4th. Around 1,000 miners surrendered to the Army, while the rest went home. While the numbers of dead have never been confirmed, there are estimates of 20 to 100 killed on the miner side and 30 killed on the Chafin side of the conflict. There were hundreds of wounded and injured. It is estimated that 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired during the days of the battle. Many faced charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, insurrection, and treason against the state of West Virginia for their participation in the march from Lynn's Creek to Logan County and the ensuing battle of Blair Mountain. These charges were levied against 550 to close to 1,000 miners and labor activists, including Kingsley and Mooney. After all of the legal battles, most of the men were acquitted, while others spent years in prison. However, the legal battles had taken a huge toll on the bank accounts of the UMWA. The Union's membership also dropped by half in the years between 1921 and 1924. This membership further dropped to just a couple of hundred miners by the 1930s. However, this battle did lead to some improvements in working conditions at the mines. The battles raised awareness of the harsh working conditions of the coal mines. Unions also had a change in tactics in political battles. This major change helped the unions get laws passed to help the labor. We thank you for watching our series on Matewan and the battle for Blair Mountain.